Hi folks, my name's Lisa. Welcome to my channel. I am down here in Baja California Sur, Mexico. I'm in an area called Cerritos Beach, which is just north of Cabo San Lucas, and I have been traveling while knitting. And so I thought I'd give you some tips on how you can travel with your knitting. Tip number 1. If you are flying, I'm sure you're wondering whether you can fly with knitting needles, as well as your scissors and other notions. And the answer is yes. TSA requires that your knitting needles be under 7 inches, and I recommend that you travel with either only wood or plastic needles. I have done a lot of flying with knitting and knitting needles, and only once have I had needles confiscated from me, and those were metal. And that was flying from Mexico to the United States. I think it was just a random thing. If I had bought it and found guidelines I could pull up on my computer, maybe I could have saved the needles and been able to continue working on my project on the plane. But lesson learned, and for years I've just been traveling since with wood needles. Also, I recommend carrying 2 sets of the same needle. I'd put 1 set in your carry-on if you're going to be knitting while in transit, and then I'd put the same size needle in your check-in bag, just in case. That way, if you're going to a place where there's no knitting supplies, you're still going to be able to work on your projects. Tip number 2. I recommend knitting with circular needles while you're traveling. There's a couple reasons why. One is if you're flying, for instance, or on a bus or train, and you drop one of your straight knitting needles, it's going to be really awkward having to try and retrieve that from the seats behind you, or if it rolls down the bus aisle, it's just going to be inconvenient for everybody. Circular needles, you really can't lose those because the yarn will already be on the needle and it'll be right in your lap. If you don't know how to use circular needles, this is a time to learn how to use them as if they were 2 regular straight needles. If I can help it, I will only knit with circular needles just because of convenience sake, but I think it's a good lesson to learn and have in your toolbox. Tip number 3, don't forget to have a knit bag specifically for knitting. And within that knit bag, maybe it could be like a cloth bag. I have this big old cloth bag, but I use that for the car because I can just throw it next to me while I'm knitting, or on the floor while I'm knitting. But if you don't want it that big, just make sure it's a cloth bag that can fit your needles, your notions, and your yarn. And within that cloth bag, if you want to be super organized, I'd put the notions in a little baggie or maybe a little sewing case, and then I'd put the yarn in maybe a separate plastic baggie because it'll get tossed around perhaps, and you don't want the yarn to get ruined. But I'd keep it super organized within its own sewing bag. And don't forget notions like tape measure and scissors. And you are allowed to bring scissors on flights. They just have to be under 4 inches according to TSA guidelines. If you are uneasy about bringing scissors, you could also just use nail clippers, and those you're allowed to bring. Tip number 4. I suggest when you are picking a project to knit while in transit to make it a mindless project. If you have to think about the stitches or the pattern or look at the pattern constantly while in transit, you are most likely going to make mistakes because when you're traveling, there's so many distractions and you're not in full control usually of your situations and surroundings. So pick something mindless. For instance, when I was driving down here to Mexico with my husband and I was in the passenger seat, I had chosen to knit a scarf and just the garter stitch pattern, and I could do that while looking out the window, while helping navigate areas to drive, and just make sure our dogs were all good. It was totally mindless. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to worry about making mistakes. Tip number 5, the pattern. So you should make sure you have multiple ways to access your pattern. I print my patterns so I can go to the beach and use it. I'll have the patterns downloaded as well as make screenshots in case I can't use Wi-Fi wherever I end up. And you could also put it on your Kindle. Tip number 6. I do not recommend you bringing expensive equipment or yarn. regarding knitting needles or special pendants that are scissors, just in case someone decides that you aren't allowed to fly with it. You might be devastated to lose something that's either sentimental or expensive. If you do decide to bring that sentimental item, make sure you have at least a self-addressed stamped envelope with your carry-on, just in case TSA does decide to pull it from the carry-on allowance, and that way you can send it home and you won't lose anything. Tip number 7. Make sure you have a good stash of yarn. Don't bring all your yarn with you on your trip. Try and organize it so you can estimate how many projects you think you'll be able to do while you're traveling, and then bring enough yarn to do those projects, just in case there's no supply store where you're going. And I've had to learn this the hard way, because I assumed while I was here in Mexico I'd be able to get yarn at the local yarn store, but I'm in southern Baja and there are no yarn stores around, no knit community. I'm very disappointed in that. Luckily though, I did bring a bin of yarn. I had a nice stash at home, and I thought I'm gonna bring this just in case, and I was hoping I'd get some local yarn or meet some local knitters and get the insight of knitting around here. It didn't happen, but I had that backup of the stash of yarn, and I'm thankful for it. Tip number 8. This is my favorite tip. Find a knit community where you are traveling to. Make it part of your trip to be a part of the knit community and learn about the local patterns and traditions of knitting in the area you're going to. It can be part of your travel experience. So I hope these travel tips for knitting have helped you, and please give it a thumbs up if it has, and don't forget to subscribe below as well. And I hope you have a great trip and happy travels, and let me know in the comments if you find knit communities or exciting things about knitting in a new area that you're traveling to. I'd love to hear what you've learned so I can maybe go travel there myself. And happy knitting. Bye.